I need to declare an interest. In 1975, I think it was, I voted for the United Kingdom to remain in the European Union, and I shall do so again. And my point of view is not going to be a Central and East European one. It's going to be a UK point of view and a pan-European or Europe-wide point of view. I think that the arguments for Brexit that we hear continuously are, in some sense, subject to what one might rather pompously, I hope you'll excuse me, call the Newtonian fallacy. In other words, the assumption is that changing the state, leaving Europe, will not in a significant way affect Europe itself. I think that's fundamentally mistaken, but because, first of all, because Britain is very large, you have very small entities could leave without affecting Europe. I believe that effect will be very large, and I think it'll actually be disastrous, not only for Europe, but also, of course, for the United Kingdom itself. And here I will quote Churchill, if I may. And I think it's not unfair. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he once said, "Europe's important to England," as one said in those days, "because it's where the weather comes from." And of course it is where the weather comes from. And the argument that because Europe's absorbed in dealing with the Eurozone crisis, which is true, and everything that Norman Lamont said about the Eurozone I agree with entirely, and I shall come back to that in a minute. There's no way that leaving the European Union will mean that the effect of a catastrophe in the Eurozone, or even the effect of long-term instability and very low growth, will not have a fundamental impact on the UK. The impact will be just as large. Now, as I said, and that part of the reason is that the European Union, but the European Union above all, are in an extremely fragile state at the moment. So I'm not going to argue against the principle of Brexit, which is what Norman Lamont and indeed John O'Sullivan talked about a lot. I shall be talking against this Brexit at this time, because that is what I think we should be talking about, because the referendum is 4 weeks down the line. I also need to, therefore, give you a health warning. My talk will be part of Project Fear. The reason for that is that I'm just terrified. So it's an honest part of Project Fear. Now, going back to just 3 points that Norman Lamont made, which I disagree with particularly. The first one is his statement that the Eurozone is on the way, or the European Union, but particularly the Eurozone, is on its way to becoming a political union, and that when people talk about creating a European state, a European demos, a European federation, they're not just talking about that, they actually really mean it. Well, I've had the experience of 60 ECOFIN councils over 6 years, and quite a number of heads of state and government councils. And I have never in that period heard anyone say that, let alone publicly, but I mean either publicly or privately. Never ever have I heard that. So my point to Norman Lamont would be, maybe that was true in the 70s before they got closer to a political union. Nowadays, no one speaks about it. Secondly, the argument that's often heard is that because the Eurozone is is going to become more intensively integrated, needs to become more intensively integrated, which is slightly different. The result is that they will agree on how they're going to vote in the subsequent councils, subsequent sectoral and heads of state councils, and above all, of course, in the ECOFIN Council. Well, I can tell you that my experience, again, is that this has hardly ever happened. I remember one particular case where there was a Eurogroup meeting, and after that Eurogroup meeting, the meeting was widened to the non-Eurozone ministers, finance ministers, and as we came in, Christine Lagarde, who was then French finance minister, said to us, "Oh, thank God you've come. Maybe we'll be able to make some progress, because we've been at each other's eyes with our nails for so long, because we simply can't agree on things, and maybe you coming in will calm the atmosphere down." The fact is, you can't have it both ways. You can't, on the one hand, say, and I think correctly, and Martin Feldstein was right, the euro has in fact increased tensions in Europe, very dramatically. But you can't say that on the one hand, and then say they're going to caucus and agree among themselves, and then impose their decisions on us once they've done that. The two things are just mutually, logically inconsistent. The final point to Norman Lamont is that, yes, the United Kingdom may have lost votes on a number of things, although I've seen situations where the United Kingdom has just won the shirt off the backs of the French and the Germans. As president of the European Council, one situation where George Osborne was so effective in his, and so ruthless in his negotiating, that at the end the French ambassador, almost in tears, said, "Mais Monsieur le Ministre, ce n'est pas le fair play." To which I told him, well, you know what they teach them at public school. They teach them all about fair play, and then when they leave at 18, they say, "And now you will never do that again." You know, yes, it's true, sometimes you lose votes. The question that I would have is, what about all the things that are going to be imposed on you without any kind of a vote if you leave? And I think that is much more to be feared from a British point of view. But to come back to the wider context, as I said, I agree with a lot of the diagnosis that Norman Lamont presented, particularly about the Eurozone. We both agree with Pope Francis that there's a lot wrong with Europe, and it hasn't been able to exhibit the political creativeness that it needs. I agree that the euro is effectively a historical failure, but you know, we are where we are, and the old Irish or Dubliners joke that if I were going to Dublin Castle, I wouldn't start from here, that's not a way to make real progress. Now, as I say, I agree with Norman Lamont that the Eurozone crisis is at the root of this is much more than malaise. These tremors which have been, and in some sense, growing tremors that have been going through the European political system. But there are other views. I think that the Eurozone crisis is based on fundamentally the fact that the Germans are completely unwilling to agree to a joint fiscal policy, which I think is absolutely essential in today's circumstances. You don't need a transfer union to keep the Eurozone functioning. It's not a choice between austerity and a transfer union. There is something in between, a joint fiscal policy, which would mean that those who can afford to expand their deficits do so, while those who can't, like the Greeks, don't. But, you know, there are other views. Tim Congdon, we were talking earlier, said that he believes that there's no need for expansionary fiscal policy in most places in the world, and also, I assume, in the Eurozone. All you need is monetary policy. If that's right, then actually the Eurozone has the instruments to stabilize itself. because the European Central Bank is conducting extremely expansionary monetary policy, and then everything will be okay, and then that part of the Brexit arguments that we've heard earlier about, you know, let's get, the real problem is the euro, we should get as far away from it as possible, fall out. I disagree with that. I think that the Eurozone crisis is really fundamental, and I think the Eurozone crisis stems from a fundamental political problem. The real problem in Europe is effectively the primacy of German domestic politics over everything. Jean-Claude Juncker once told me that we can't make this decision, when he was a Luxembourg finance minister, we can't make this decision now because there's going to be a regional election in Germany. And then he sort of stopped and said, this is so useful for the Germans, and we're thinking of dividing Luxembourg up into regions. The fact is that German predominance is, the rent that Germany gets from its predominance is in fact spent on on domestic political expenditure, if you like, not financial expenditure, but political expenditure. And the result of that, part of the result of that, is that there has been a massive failure of leadership in Germany. Or maybe that's the cause of that, is that there's been a massive failure of political leadership in Germany. Listen to the way the Germans talk about what is happening in the Eurozone. It's almost always the Greek crisis. It took them 3 years to start talking about the Eurozone crisis, and then as quickly as they could, they stopped talking about the Eurozone crisis. Because if it's a Greek crisis, then it's the fault of the Greeks. If it's a Eurozone crisis, they constructed the euro wrong, and I'm convinced that they did, and they would have to admit that it's also partly their fault, but in doing that, I mean the elites, the German elites would have to admit that, in doing that they would at least make it clear to the German voters, this is our common European, at least Eurozone problem, and they've been unwilling to do that. Now, one other point about Brexit in itself. I'm actually surprised that nobody has mentioned or talked about the models that the various international institutions have all presented, showing that Brexit would be certainly a short-term, huge disadvantage to the United Kingdom, and in the long run, probably a disadvantage. And I'm surprised that the two speakers who spoke before me haven't poured scorn on these models, because it's quite clear that these kinds of models are not actually capable of generating those sorts of results. But, you know, to be absolutely frank, it's a little bit as if you're facing someone who has taken LSD, and he goes up to the window and he says, I'm going to jump out of this window because I can fly. And he can't fly. And of course you could, if you wanted to, devise all sorts of models which would be better or worse to show how he's likely to fall and how many bones he's likely to break. They would not be really very useful models, I agree with that. But the fact that it's not a good idea to jump out of the fourth floor window is fairly clear. And it seems to me that that's the situation with Brexit. It's extremely dangerous in the short term, maybe in the long term, who knows. So, to turn to the key questions. I've already mentioned that, in fact, the United Kingdom has a great deal of autonomy within the EU. It manages to be one of the most deregulated economies in the world, according to the OECD. That may be measured wrong, but it doesn't feel terribly regulated compared to most other countries that one tends to visit. And certainly a lot less regulated than countries like China or India. It has huge influence. I've already mentioned how effective British negotiators often are. And now I'd like to turn to really the key point. Europe is fragile. If the United Kingdom leaves, it's quite likely to have very serious knock-on effects. It certainly increases the likelihood of a Le Pen victory in France. Who knows, maybe a Grillo victory in Italy. And we do know, and I think we can already see that these dangerous populist and extreme right-wing tendencies have a tendency not just to be very disruptive, but they actually, once they start on that route, they go in a more and more dangerous and irresponsible direction. I think a very good example of this is Turkey. I mean, when Turkey started out on the Erdogan adventure, I don't think anyone thought it would be a country that would be engaging in this kind of extremely unpragmatic foreign policy. So I think there's a real danger that one will start a process of disintegration of the European Union, which would be extremely serious for British security interests. People say, and Norman Lamont has said that, well, for security we have NATO. No, excuse me. In my deep conviction, I'm deeply convinced that we have NATO for defense, but security is not having to even think that you will ever need to use the defense. And so for security, we have the stability that the European Union provides. And the other thing that strikes me is that's maybe impolitely I mentioned the LSD parallel, but the extraordinary self-confidence, and it is extraordinarily, it is very striking, of the Brexiteers that the United Kingdom will do well on the world stage, on world markets, after having left the European Union. And the point here is, and I'm again arguing about this Brexit, not about a Brexit in 10 years' time when things may have calmed down and may have stabilized and the world may be in a much safer state. But at the moment, we have the rise of these populist, very right-wing and very nationalistic forces. We have quite possible Trump presidency. Now, what is that going to do to the world trading system? What is that going to do to the world trading system? Even if the United Kingdom would do well in the world trading system as it exists at the moment, there's a huge risk that the world trading system in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time will be very much more fragmented, many more nationalistic and protectionist policies, and then belonging to a large regional trade area could actually be very useful to a big regional trading bloc. And the other thing that I find striking is the deep belief of the Brexiteers that UK politics will remain free market. I would warn them to beware of getting what they wish for. The same populist and anti-trade forces that are at work in the United States could well take hold in the United Kingdom. And then the decision to have left would turn out to have been a major mistake from a classical liberal free market point of view. So what I would stress is the asymmetry of the decision. The decision to leave today is a decision to leave, and it can't be reversed. The decision not to leave today doesn't mean that there can't be a decision to leave in a more stable situation a number of years down the line. The question is, do you remove the appendix at the time when the person is ill for many other reasons, or do you wait until things have stabilized? And in this particular case, I'm deeply convinced it would be better to wait. And that, thank you, is where I would like to end.